Welcome to this explainer. Okay, we are jumping right into this one because today we are looking at a truly startling historical argument about the very foundations of the modern American public school system. Most of us grew up sitting in neat little rows, moving to the sound of a bell, and taking endless standardized tests, right? We just kind of assumed this system was built to educate us, to enlighten us, to help us grow. But according to some fascinating source material tracing the history of American education, the system we know today wasn't actually built to create scholars at all. It was engineered, literally, to manufacture something else entirely. Just listen to the sheer starkness of this language. This is a direct quote from an internal document of the General Education Board back in 1903. This board, by the way, was established by John D. Rockefeller with a massive $180 million endowment. To put that in perspective, that is over $6 billion in today's money. The source material highlights that this wasn't some hidden, shadowy conspiracy. It was documented, on-the-record policy. The explicit goal, straight from the architects of this board, was not to raise up philosophers or artists or independent thinkers. Nope. The goal was to mold obedient, predictable, and manageable workers. They wanted people who would do exactly what they were told perfectly, without ever questioning the system that employed them. All right, Section 1, Learning Before the Factory Model. To really grasp the magnitude of this shift, we kind of have to understand what things looked like before this massive industrial intervention took hold. Let's step back in time for just a second. The difference between these two eras is literally night and day. On one side, we have the pre-1900 educational landscape. It was incredibly decentralized. Communities and parents actually controlled what was taught. Even in those little rural one-room schoolhouses, children were often taught a classical education. We're talking things like the trivium and quadrivium, focusing heavily on logic, rhetoric, and philosophy. They were actually taught how to reason from first principles. Contrast that with the post-1900 model. Suddenly, boom, we see standardized curriculums, mandatory attendance laws, vocational tracking, and a massive emphasis on compliance. Education totally transitioned from the cultivation of wisdom to straight-up job training. Now, you might be thinking, well, obviously, the new standardized system was necessary because people weren't really learning before, right? But the source points out a truly surprising statistic. By some estimates, in the early 1800s, literacy rates among certain populations actually exceeded 90%. Think about that. That's higher than it is today. And that was long before compulsory, centralized schooling was even a thing. Highly effective learning was absolutely already happening. So the source makes a crucial point here. The reforms weren't necessarily about teaching people how to read. They were about teaching people how to comply. Moving on to Section 2, Engineering the Modern School System. So, how exactly did this sweeping transformation of American minds actually happen? How did a few incredibly wealthy industrialists re-engineer an entire nation's way of learning? Well, the answer lies in a concept you usually hear about in business school: vertical integration. John D. Rockefeller famously used this strategy to build his Standard Oil monopoly. He didn't just sell oil. He controlled the wells, the refineries, the railroads, the distribution, the whole shebang. Total control of the supply chain. According to our source material, the Rockefellers took this exact same legendary playbook and applied it directly to human capital. Because think about it. If you control education, you control the next generation's thinking, their values, and their aspirations. And this business strategy translates into a brilliant, albeit kind of terrifying, three-step blueprint for taking over a decentralized system. Step 1, you fund the university education departments, like the ones at Columbia and Chicago, so you can engineer the teacher training programs from the top. Step 2, control the textbook publishers. Publishing giants like McGraw-Hill and Pearson rose to dominance with this backing, ensuring the exact same carefully curated version of history and science was taught nationwide. Step 3, draft state mandatory attendance laws so every single child is legally required to participate. It was a meticulous, top-down system engineered entirely under the banner of progress and charity. All right, Section 3, the mechanics of student compliance. With the laws passed and the textbooks written, we gotta look inside the physical and psychological environment built within these new factory model schools. I really want you to reflect on your own school memories for a moment. Think about that Pavlovian urge to pack your bags the very second a bell rings. The rigid schedules, the requirement to sit perfectly still and absorb information without questioning it. The source actually notes that the foundation funded research into behavioral psychology, specifically backing B.F. Skinner. They were basically treating human beings like programmable machines through stimulus response conditioning. On top of that, they funded the development of standardized testing, things like the SAT and IQ tests. And the source argues these weren't neutral measuring tools. They were designed as ways to sort students into data points, to be deployed wherever the industrial system needed them. It was, quite literally, factory worker conditioning. Which brings us to Section 4, two different educational destinies. Here is where the source's historical analysis takes an even darker turn. Because this factory model education, it wasn't meant for everyone. A parallel, two-tiered education system was intentionally maintained to separate the classes. The contrast is absolutely wild when you look at it. In the public schools, designed for the workers, a subject like civics basically meant memorizing the three branches of government. Meanwhile, over in the elite private academies, the future ruling class was busy debating political philosophy and the Federalist Papers. In thinking, public schools focused on vocational tracking and just following directions. Private academies, on the other hand, taught Latin, logic, and how to actively identify propaganda. And in finance, public students learned basic checkbook math, while the children of the wealthy learned estate planning, tax optimization, and investing. Two completely different systems, resulting in two entirely different destinies in life. Okay, Section 5, Modern Outcomes and Alternative Paths. So, what happens when you run a system like this for over a century? Let's bring this explainer up to the present day and examine the long-term statistical results of this 120-year-old blueprint. This number is a real eye-opener. Back in the year 1900, nearly 40% of American workers were self-employed. Today, that number has plummeted to under 10%. According to the source, this isn't just some random accident of history. Creating a compliant, corporate-dependent workforce that relied on wage employment rather than entrepreneurship was a successful designed feature of this new education system. And this trend is perfectly reinforced by the dramatic collapse of independent farming. In 1900, independent farmers made up 41% of the workforce. Today, it is literally less than 2%. The source argues this was the intentional collapse of independence, basically replacing a nation of self-reliant individuals with a society where most people depend entirely on massive corporations for their basic survival. But hey, it's not all doom and gloom. The source also points out that you don't actually have to participate in this factory model. Alternatives are absolutely thriving today. Homeschooling families are bypassing the system entirely, and their students are scoring 15 to 30 percentile points higher on standardized tests. There's also unschooling, which leans heavily into natural curiosity, classical education co-ops that are bringing back logic and philosophy, and democratic free schools. These alternative paths often yield not only higher test scores, but much higher civic engagement, completely outside the traditional assembly line. However, it is absolutely crucial to understand that the machinery of the original plan hasn't stopped. The source claims that this legacy of top-down control is maintained today by new philanthropic names. Mega foundations are utilizing the exact same strategies, funding curriculums, shaping state laws, all to ensure the factory model continues humming along perfectly under the guise of modern education. Which loops us right back to the chilling core of this entire historical argument. A quote attributed to John D. Rockefeller himself says it all. "I don't want a nation of thinkers, I want a nation of workers." According to the documents and the outcomes presented in our source, he got exactly what he paid for. A system designed not to liberate human potential, but to use it. And that brilliantly sets up our final thought for this explainer. If the bells that trained you, the grades that sorted you, and the tests that reduced your entire worth to a data point were all designed to create compliance, well, the question you've got to ask yourself now is simple. Are you going to keep giving the system what it wants? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this leaves you looking at your own educational journey and the choices you make for the future in a completely new light.